Hello. Welcome to the latest installment of the Institute of Politics reflection on America in the Trump era. Tonight the subject is trade. We could not have a higher level panel than we've assembled for you here, and I won't address that because we have a great introducer to do that job. I will point out that tomorrow night at International House, we're going to continue this discussion with a discussion on health care, which is another place in which policy is taking a significant shift, or potentially taking a significant shift in this new era, and I urge you all to attend that as well. And you can find out about more upcoming events on our website at politicsuchicago.edu. After the moderated discussion, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. We're going to prioritize the first 3 questions from students before the young at heart get to ask their questions, and make sure that they are questions, which means that they have a question mark at the end of them and not speeches. Please silence your cell phones. And now to formally introduce our guests, I get to introduce Simon Daffarete. Now, make sure I say this right. Daffarete from Florida. Simon is a second year in the college studying political science and economics. Simon.
Thank you so much, David, for that introduction. It's not every day that someone gets to be introduced by David Axelrod, so it's truly an honor. First and foremost, I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's event, America in the Trump Era, the Future of Trade. In the 2016 election, we saw some very interesting rhetoric about our trade policies and our standing as a global economic power. Under the new Trump regime, where do we go from there? What does the future of the TPP and NAFTA look like? Under his new direction, what will our relations look like with our economic partners? Will we start taking tariffs and protective measures for our trade and policies? Here to help us answer some of these questions and provide some much needed insight into the uncertainty of our future, we have former U.S. Trade Representative Michael Froman, who served under the Obama administration from 2013 to 2017. And prior to that, he served as Deputy National Security Advisor for the International Economic Affairs for the National Security Council and National Economic Council. He also served on President Obama's transition team in 2008. And also here with us is the Director of Research at the Economic Policy Institute, Josh Bivens. And his areas of research include economics on globalization, fiscal and monetary policy, and social insurance. And this event will be moderated by our IOP visiting fellow, Jackie Combs. Jackie is a former White House correspondent for the New York Times, and she focuses on politics and economic policy. And she also moderated our event with Julian Castro previously. And we are thankful that she has been able to be here to provide a lot of insight into her career on politics and journalism with her seminars. And with that, I hope you all enjoy the event, and thank you so much.
Well, welcome to you all. This is such a timely topic because if you had to pick one issue that helped define this race, considering to the extent there were issues that defined the race, it would be trade. But there wasn't much discussion about the actual, specifics, the policy and the actual economic underpinnings and the foreign policy implications for trade. And so I'm going to get right to it, because when I did one of these the other day, I sort of felt like I gave short shrift to the time allowed for your questions, which is what I want to make time for tonight. But first, before we start to the Trump era, I wanted to look back first and ask both of you to sort of take a few minutes to define what you see as the Obama legacy on trade, and whether, paradoxically, he was, as we know, the second Democratic president in a row to espouse a pro-trade agenda against the wishes of a majority in his party, but But we had essentially had a bipartisan consensus in this country for decades. It was a fragile consensus, but a consensus nonetheless. So paradoxically, is his legacy presiding over the end of that bipartisan consensus on global trade as we'd known it, with a little help from Trump and Bernie Sanders, of course? Mike, why don't you go first?
Well, look, I think it's a little premature to make a judgment on that. I think what the Obama administration did do was, one, make clear that since the U.S. is an open economy, we need to have access to other economies. We need to level the playing field. That means tearing down barriers abroad and raising standards in other countries so that it helps American workers and farmers and small businesses here. And we did that through TPP, was working on that through TTIP, but also worked in the multilateral trading system at the World Trade Organization to redirect it from a cul-de-sac that it was in, where developed countries were expected to open their markets, but not big emerging markets like China. And we put an end to that and made it clear that if there were going to be agreements at the WTO, they needed to be fair for developed countries and the workers in those countries as well. So I think we took a lot of steps in that direction. Obviously, it's unfinished business. A lot of what I hear from the comments from the Trump administration about trade, like the president tweeting the other day how unfair it is that other countries have barriers to our exports while we have an open market, that's very much our belief as well. It was our belief, and that's very much why we tried to work hard to tear down those barriers abroad. And how they play out their trade policy, I think, remains to be seen.
Josh?
If I can step even a little further back, just beyond the Obama, and just sort of what is the role of trade over the past 30 or 40 years in contributing to sort of the economic distress and anxiety among that sort of bottom 70% of American workers who haven't seen any meaningful wage increase over that generation of time. I think there's a real case to be made that globalization has contributed to it. And I think globalization sort of writ large, forget about, lots of it was going to happen anyway, regardless of what policy did, and unless we literally built walls, which we're now going to literally build walls. But if we had not done that, there would have been an increase in trade regardless. And that was going to be tough on lots of American workers. People think economics teaches that globalization is always win-win. It doesn't teach that. It teaches that it's win-win between countries if you make enough assumptions. But in terms of different groups of workers within a country, it can be really strongly redistributive. And for a country like the US, really abundant in capital, skills, and credential, integrating with a poorer global economy that's very labor abundant, the prediction is it's going to be tough for wages for a country like the United States. And that's the theory, and evidence backs it up. So I think globalization was always going to be pretty tough on American wages. And this is not just manufacturing workers who lose their jobs because of imports. That's the most visible. They take the biggest individual loss. It's also landscapers. They don't get replaced by imports, but their wages are hurt because they have to compete with laid-off apparel workers. And so you're really talking about the bottom 70% of American workers who've seen wage growth slower than it would have been otherwise because of the effect of globalization. And I don't think we've come to anywhere near an agreement on what is the size and the scope of compensation we want to provide those workers for the fact that they've suffered this loss. And then two quick things on the policy front, because I think that's globalization that would have happened no matter what, pretty much. I think the specific trade agreements we've signed, especially since NAFTA, I think they have amplified the regressive implications of globalization. I think they have eroded lots of protections for American workers' wages by essentially allowing American capital owners to have the same protection for their investments that they had in the US, and that was linked to American workers, so they had to bargain with American workers. We've used these trade agreements to sort of extend those protections so they can set up shop abroad and enjoy the same legal, regulatory, institutional protections there, basically putting American workers and foreign workers in competition with each other. And they've beefed up explicit protections for lots of American companies' profits. If you look at intellectual property industries like pharmaceuticals, software, entertainment, they are explicitly in these trade treaties that other countries have to become bill collectors for companies like Pfizer and Microsoft. That is not free trade. That's very selective protectionism in a way that is not very good for American workers. And then I think the last big policy mistake we've made that has amplified the challenges of globalization, we've allowed the dollar to become persistently overvalued on currency markets. It makes our exports really expensive in the global market, so people don't buy many of them. It makes imports really cheap. We buy lots of them. That has really been a problem for American manufacturing. It is not true that American manufacturing has been losing jobs for decades and decades. It's been losing as a share of overall employment for a long time. The jobs and US manufacturing were incredibly stable for 35 years between 1965 and 2000. It's only since 2000 that you've seen the implosion, and that is very much an issue of trade deficits and unbalanced trade. And so I think it's not a shock that American workers feel squeezed by globalization, and they need somewhere to put that anger, and it goes on these trade agreements. And perhaps it's outsized anger on the specifics of the trade agreements, but that's what they see. That's the policy instrument they see being wielded, and they just know that this has not been working on their behalf.
Before I go on to another question, I wanted to follow up on a couple things you said, but we'll get to those. If either of you want to jump in after and respond, Mike, if you had a response to what Josh
Well,
has
look, I agree with Josh in that I think globalization has had an impact on the American workforce, on wages, on the bargaining power of workers in the United States. And most economists will tell you that while automation accounts for 80% plus of job displacement in the US, globalization certainly plays a force as well. I think the question is always, what do you do about it? Because if we do nothing, then we continue to compete against low-wage labor all over the world, whether it's coming from Mexico or Vietnam or China. And with the approach that we took in TPP, it was very much of the view, well, let's make sure we're raising labor standards in these other countries so that our workers aren't competing against workers that don't have access to free and independent unions, or who can't strike, or who can't affiliate with who they want to affiliate. Let's make sure that in those other countries with whom we're trading, there's a more fair and level playing field. And let's make sure our exports, while we're an open economy, our average applied tariff is 1.4%. But you take a country like Vietnam, has a 70% tax on our exports of autos, or a 50% tax on machinery, or a 35% tax on auto parts. If we want to be in that market, you face two choices. You can either close down your operation here and move to Vietnam behind the barrier, or you can tear down the barrier. And our view is it's better to tear down the barrier through these trade agreements, make sure that workers in Vietnam also have real workers' rights that are enforceable, including by trade sanctions, and that's better for our workers here in the United States.
I want to move to Trump, but we're going to come back at TPP and NAFTA as well. But I was surprised, I wondered if either of you were, that for all of his rhetoric against trade through his campaign, that he actually, in his inaugural address, was explicitly protectionist. And the quote was, "Protection will lead to great prosperity and strength." And he went on, "We will follow two simple rules, buy American and hire American." Now, this is a man who has a global business himself that has not lived by those two rules. Yet he was elected as the tribune of the anti-globalization forces. What do you expect him to do? How do you expect him to translate the campaign rhetoric, since there were very few specifics, but he has walked away from TPP? If you're looking back even 2, 3, 4 years from now, what do you think it will look like? Mike, you go first.
Well, look, I think protection leading to prosperity, that's a very Herbert Hoover sort of concept. And we saw how that kind of played out. I think we want to make sure, when he talks about how we need to add another F to NAFTA and have it be fair, I couldn't agree more. Right? We want more fairness in the global trading system. We may have slightly different views of what that means. Raising barriers to imports, in my view, really has three potential risks. One is retaliation, that when we violate our international trade obligations, we give an excuse to other countries to raise tariffs on our exports, affecting the 11.5 million Americans who owe their jobs to exports. The other is imitation. When we tell a country that we're willing to ignore our international obligations, was to stop China or other countries from saying, well, if it's good enough for the US. The US has always held out as the example. We're always required to lead by example. And if the example we're setting is that international obligations don't matter, well, good luck trying to get China or other countries to uphold their international obligations. And the final one is taxation. When you raise tariffs on imports, you are imposing a tax on the Americans least able to afford it. Low-income Americans spend a disproportionate amount of their income on tradable goods, clothing, footwear, and food. And so when you impose tariffs on those imports, you are requiring the least able Americans, the ones who are scraping to get by, to pay higher costs for their imports. On the Buy American side, I mean, first of all, I don't think there's any disagreement about the desire of driving more production, more manufacturing, more economic activity to the US. That was certainly our perspective as well, and you know what our strategy was to try and do that. If you start telling companies, if you want access to the US market, you need to move your production to the United States. That, at one level, sounds superficially attractive. Now wait for China to say, Boeing, 50% of the airplane market or something like that is Chinese. If you want to sell airplanes in China, so you got to shut down in Chicago, you got to shut down in the state of Washington and move your production to China. We would be up in arms about that. And since 95% of the world's consumers live outside the US, 80% of the purchasing power is outside the US, we need access to those markets. If other countries start copying that kind of policy, we'll be shut out of those markets.
So looking ahead, I mean, I don't expect much at all, if it's not obvious for now, much at all useful from Trump. I mean, I think his entire view of the world, and it was really clarifying in the inaugural address, actually, because this is the one he couldn't plausibly claim, oh, I just tweeted it at 3 a.m., I didn't really mean it. Presumably, there was some thought in this one. And if you look at his vision of the world, it's that American workers have had a tough time, which, okay, I agree with so far, and the people who've made off with all the gains are foreigners and bureaucrats and politicians in DC. And completely absent from that story is sort of that top 1% of the income distribution that really have made wildly disproportionate gains. And so I think of globalization, like the primary distributional conflict going on in issues of globalization is basically between classes. It's between the bottom 2/3 of workers and pretty highly paid managers and capital owners. And that's not how I think Trump sees it. Trump sees it as a pure competition between nations. And that's almost always going to lead him to do stupid things, in my view. I mean, the one case you could imagine something halfway useful being done is if he looks at the trade deficit and decides that is somehow a scoreboard for globalization and we're losing, so he wants to narrow that score, which is just sort of all wrong, but I think closing the trade deficit would be a good thing in the next couple of years. If he could focus on that and use policy tools that would actually work, maybe you could actually get somewhere and do some. My sense is, the first tool he's reached for is a tariff on Mexico, a country that does not have a global current account surplus. So the idea that they are some big free rider on it, that makes no sense. I mean, it seems to me he doesn't like Mexico. And so that was what drove his tariff on Mexico idea. And so, even when you think the stop clock might hit on something useful, my guess is probably not.
Yeah. And this, this is a good place to wedge in a question to you, since you work for an organization and your point of view is on liberal progressive, and to what extent, since he ran representing and fighting for working class voters, to what extent do you see Trump driving a wedge, even a bigger wedge that's already been driven, between the working class voters and the Democratic Party? Or do you see things like these tariffs that are going to raise prices in products in Walmart and Target and the like, actually persuading people that maybe he wasn't, or his policies aren't ones that they subscribe to?
And so, yes, so I'm very worried about that. Like, I think we have largely mismanaged our approach to globalization over the past 25 years and not given full freight to the legitimate concerns of sort of those bottom 2/3 of American workers who have been hurt by it. And so I think there's sort of a big hole that Trump drove through and was able to peel off some sort of working class voters. I actually think he will fail them pretty badly. I mean, I think his real view of the world is it is unacceptable that we lose factories to Mexico, but it's perfectly fine for American bosses to exploit their American workers to the biggest degree possible. I mean, if you look at his nominee for the labor secretary, the person who's supposed to enforce regulations protecting American workers, Andy Puzder is an outright wage thief. There are 60 suits of him just not paying his workers. He's opposed every increase in the minimum wage that has come around. And so this does not look to me like an administration that actually cares about the well-being of those bottom 2/3 of workers that have been hurt by globalization. He has some other objective function in mind. And so I have a really hard time seeing how Trumpism kind of delivers the goods to anyone in that sort of bottom 70% who voted for him.
Well, since neither of you has a pipeline into Trump's thinking, or let alone his White House, I want to ask you, though, quickly, since you know the intricacies of trade policy and how it's made, as all of us watch him as the steward of trade over the next few years, what do you see potential conflicts of interest where you think the his trade policy, his stance toward a particular country will be guided by his family's businesses there. Is there real potential for that? Do you see it?
Absolutely. I mean, until there is a release of tax returns and an actual divestiture of assets, I don't see how that shouldn't be your sort of ruling presumption.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a particular country you're watching?
No, I'm not on the sort of corruption watchdog
Yeah.
beat. I mean, you definitely, and lots of people are. It's a real beat. Yeah, I mean, is it a coincidence that no country in the travel ban is a country that he has big commercial interest in? That's not a coincidence.
Mike, is that one you want?
I don't have any great insights. Look, I think
Just the potential, at least.
they're still getting their act together. There are a lot of people. No one's been confirmed in any of the relevant positions. There's a lot of people vying for leadership or for a role on trade policy, for a policy that they seem to hate. They all want to be in charge of it. So we'll have to see how that gets sorted out. But look, I think there's a lot of growing pains I think we're seeing right now in this new White House. And of course, David's an expert on these issues. I think we'll have to see how this plays out over time.
Yeah. What you said about there being a lot of people who think they speak for him on trade, there was a question I X'd out because in jettisoning in order to get to students' questions, but there was a quote that I had taken from a Republican, and since, like I say, neither of you are on the Trump inner circle, Senator Pat Roberts, a Republican of Kansas, who was the chairman of the Agriculture Committee, recently expressed fear for what Trump's policies would mean for agriculture exports and confusion about the policy making in the Trump administration, given that you had the your successor at USTR, and you also have this White House Council on Trade, and Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce. And so his question was, who's in charge here? If you have an answer to that, feel free to jump in. But I think all of us agree, after what we've seen so far, that Trump's in charge, and ultimately, and that for him, trade, as he's made clear in his campaign, is basically the art of the deal. And his book, but it's a zero-sum game if you take him at his word as far as the art of the deal, where if we win, if the United States wins, somebody else has to lose, and if they win, we must have lost. How does that comport with the reality of trade agreements, which in my experience have been everybody has to walk away at least being able to tell their populace that they are winners?
You know, I think it turns out that other countries have politics too. Not just the United States. And I think one of the challenges that we're seeing play out is, if you're dealing with Mexico, there's a long history of politics around the U.S.-Mexican relations in Mexico. And if you're going to renegotiate NAFTA, it's going to have to be something that they can sell as well. And we don't know yet what the Trump administration means by renegotiating NAFTA and how much of it will be the kind of thing we did in TPP in terms of labor and environmental protections, or opening up their energy market, or improving certain regulations, or what other ideas they might have. But ultimately, President Peña Nieto is going to need to be able to sell to his politics that this was a win-win situation for them as well. And I think that's going to be the challenge. You need to think through the secondary and the tertiary implications of actions. We need Mexico, not just on the trade front, but to deal with illegal immigration coming from Central America, to deal with drug lords, to deal with organized crime. And all of these things raise political challenges for the Mexican government, and we need to find ways of working with them across all of these issues.
What do you think, Josh?
I think all that's right. I mean, I think there is a theoretical NAFTA out there that would be a big improvement. It seems really hard to get there. I mean, to my mind, the logic of sort of NAFTA and a lot of the trade agreements we signed, especially with poorer countries, is we will guarantee you preferential access to the big US market if you adopt a range of sort of policy preferences that work for us. Some of them are things I support, like beefed up labor standards. I think they're not enforced enough generally, but the other things are things I'm not a big fan of. Harmonizing intellectual property protection so that but that's basically the deal. We've got a bunch of stuff we would like you to do, and in exchange you get access to the US market. And it's really hard to see, and some of those things are not hugely popular in the negotiating country. And it's really hard to see, starting from a dynamic of an American president and the rhetoric he uses, that a Mexican president or NAFTA negotiator will be, no, this was a win-win negotiation that we entered and we got something and they got, I mean, you're starting from, 15 yards behind the starting line at that point. And so the idea that that sort of, delicate negotiation is off to a good start under the Trump administration is hard to believe.
Since you mentioned NAFTA, I want to jump to a question about that. When I was covering Congress for the Wall Street Journal, I covered its hard-fought consideration of NAFTA and ultimate approval of the implementing legislation, and that's been 23 years now. So in that time, you've had a great deal of, it's come to define the economic relations between the U.S. and Mexico on the one hand, the U.S. and Canada, and among the three of us. Very integrated industrial and commercial practices, not least the fact that a Mexican car, which now might be subject to a high tariff, actually includes about 40% of its parts that are U.S. made. And so what does it mean? How is it possible to renegotiate NAFTA without getting into nitty gritty? And maybe since TPP, the TPP countries included both Canada and Mexico, is there a model in there somewhere for renegotiating NAFTA?
Well, that was certainly, when candidate Obama was running for president, he called for the renegotiation of NAFTA, and he was very specific on what he meant. He talked about labor and environment being treated as seriously as every other issue, being fully enforceable, and that's precisely what we did in TPP, plus other issues. But TPP, from our perspective, was the renegotiation of NAFTA, getting labor and environmental standards, not just with Mexico and Canada, but with 40% of the global economy. So, I think it depends on what it is they want to do beyond what we've already done in TPP, and whether it's as attractive to Mexico to do it with us bilaterally as it was to do in TPP, where they were also getting access to Japan's market, to Malaysia's market, to Vietnam's market. I think there's some confusion about this bilateral versus multi-party negotiation. A lot of the value of TPP, since countries already had access to our market, was us getting them access to Japan. They were riding on our coattails, and that allowed us to encourage them to raise their standards in other areas. Whether that dynamic can play out in a bilateral context remains to be seen.
Yeah, to my mind, so renegotiating NAFTA, the really bad part of that would just be the sort of arbitrary across-the-board tariffs that Trump seems to be leading with. That's not my idea of how NAFTA needs to be improved, is higher tariffs on goods coming into the U.S. I could imagine some things that Mexico might like the ability to do a little more protection for their agricultural sector. Maybe the shock of NAFTA is over. That was one not totally foreseen shock of NAFTA to Mexico, was the fact that lots of cheap American agricultural goods came into the country and drove a lot of people off farms in Mexico. Maybe that shock has gone past and they no longer, but my guess is they would probably like a little more control over that. I think the investor-state dispute settlement provisions in NAFTA and most of the trade agreements that followed, I don't see a large rationale for those. I think they are basically giving corporations a lot of sway over government policy that they should not have sway. They should be more democratically negotiated. And so I could imagine having those come out of NAFTA. It's unclear whether that would be I think, again, this is where the divisions break down more along classes than among countries. I'm sure the Mexican capital owning class likes a lot of ISDS, and they join with the American capital owning class in liking that. And so it's not so obvious Mexico likes this, US likes this. You have to look at sort of the cross-border coalitions that sort of break down more on class lines. So I do think there is a better NAFTA out there. I think it's a really tough needle to thread, and I don't think the person who's trying to thread it is going to get the job done.
Do you even think it's really necessary to be renegotiated from your point of view?
Not hugely. I would say that the two big priorities I would have is One, we really should get the exchange rate right and keep it right. I mean, we should treat the exchange rate about as seriously as we treat the interest rate with the Federal Reserve, having a body that says this macroeconomic price has to be right because it has really big consequences for the economy. We should treat the exchange rate the same way. I think we would diffuse a lot of toxic trade politics if we just had 4 million more manufacturing jobs, which I think we could have had if we had not had the exchange rate be so wrong for the past 15 years. Right. And then I think I would not do more trade agreements in the model of NAFTA. I think the idea of coming back in time and ripping that up, because like you said, there are integrated supply chains now with companies that are in Mexico, US, and Canada, and rooting all that back up after it's grown up around NAFTA could be almost as bad a jolt as what happened when it all fell back out.
Mike, did you have a
Look,
comment?
I don't necessarily disagree with Josh on this. I think on the currency, the irony, of course, is that TPP was the first trade agreement to have a currency arrangement where countries agreed as to what was appropriate exchange rate policy. They agreed to a series of transparency measures so that for the first time, we'd be able to know when a country was intervening in the markets, by how much, how often. And then there was an accountability mechanism where the finance authorities would hold each other accountable for living up to those exchange rate mechanisms. What it didn't do, as some of the critics have raised, it didn't end in trade sanctions. And that's an interesting question. Now, the reason why it didn't end in trade sanctions is because while we have a very clear idea that if a country consistently intervenes in the market on one side of the exchange rate and is running a current account surplus, that they might be manipulating their currency. Other countries look to us and say, well, when you do quantitative easing, it has exactly the same effect, right? You're expanding your monetary base, you're weakening your dollar, you're depreciating your dollar, you're getting a trade advantage. And if you want us to put our intervention on the table, you need to put your monetary policy on the table. That was the discussion. We were attacked by countries like Brazil for engaging in a currency war. And we certainly thought, back in the days of the 08, 09 financial crisis, that it was important for the Federal Reserve to do whatever it thought was necessary to save the economy, to stimulate the economy. We would never subject our monetary policy to a trade tribunal and to trade sanctions. And so it stopped short of that. But TPP, for the first time, established the idea that, exactly as Josh suggested, currency is relevant to the broader trade relationship, and there need to be rules and procedures and transparency around those policies so that our trading partners can hold each other accountable.
Josh, you look like you want to say
Yeah,
something.
sorry,
I figured he might.
No, it was a pet peeve of mine during the whole debate. You're right, there were some people in countries like Brazil claiming that the Fed's actions were currency manipulation. They're just not. It's a clear, bright line difference. Quantitative easing by the Fed is when we buy our own assets to affect interest rates. Currency management is when a country buys some other country's assets to work on the exchange rate. Those are very different things, and that is a bright line distinction between what should be sort of actionable or something that could be countervailed upon versus what can't be.
I would just tell you, as a trade negotiator, it's very convenient to try and define the problem that only applies to other countries. That's not a very successful way to negotiate, because no other country sees the world that way. They say, what you do through quantitative easing has exactly the same impact as what we do through intervention. And yeah, you can put it in one category, we can put it in another category, but we're not going to agree to bind our intervention policy unless you agree to bind your monetary policy. And that's something we would never do, and nobody should want us to do it.
No one should want us to do it. I think that one can be kind of, I mean, that to me is a reason to walk away from the negotiation if there's that stark a disagreement on the sort of facts of whether or not it does have the same effect. I mean, it doesn't have the same effect.
Does it weaken the dollar?
Marginally.
So does intervention.
Nope.
Well, you have intervention by an economy that has an open capital account. It has a marginal short-term impact.
A marginal short-term impact, exactly. Not a direct first-round large impact, which comes from buying another country's assets.
I would say when you intervene, you have the same impact.
No. No, they're different orders of magnitude. One, the interest rate moves like this, and the exchange rate like this. The other, exchange rate, interest rate. I mean, there are economic tests and empirical papers that could be brought to bear on which one.
If we look at the 2009 experience, I think you'll find that the kind of monetary intervention that the Fed did had very similar effects to some of the interventions that people complained about other countries doing.
Well, then the answer is they should be able to counter-intervene. And then, you know what, you don't like us buying our own assets, you buy your assets to your heart's
So
content.
having established one strong disagreement, or at least one.
I thought we'd spice it up a
Let
little
me
bit.
segue to another one that you might have, and that is like back to TPP. One of the fundamental arguments, if not the fundamental argument, that you, Mike, and the administration was making for it was the geopolitical value. You know, less the economic and stressing that the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the alliance it created with these 11 other countries along the Asia-Pacific rim would stand, and they welcomed it as a bulwark against a rising China both economically and militarily, and that it would call into question in the United States leadership in the world that dates back 70 years to the post-World War I period. Have you seen evidence? I want you to address that, if there's a point about that you want to add, but also it's early, but is there any evidence that by walking away from TPP, and it was actually on death's door for a long time before he actually was sworn in, evidence of some of the bad effects you've seen? And then Josh, you can respond.
Yeah, look, I think we're seeing this play out in real time. I mean, to take a step back, the U.S., our future is very much tied to the future of the Asia-Pacific region. It's where the bulk of the world's population is. It's where the bulk of the growth is. We will succeed or fail in large measure upon our relationship with that region. And that's why President Obama launched the rebalancing strategy towards Asia, that it was important as a Pacific power that we be involved there, not just militarily, but economically and politically as well. Not to contain China, but because the definition of Asia is still up for question. Is Asia's identity going to be trans-Pacific in nature, or is it going to be China-centric in nature? And that's what's really at stake here. And TPP offered the prospects that Asia might define itself in a trans-Pacific manner, much like Europe oftentimes defines itself in an Atlanticist manner, sees itself as a transatlantic, and part of a transatlantic community. Instead, what we're seeing is China's got its regional strategy, and it's playing out, it's implementing it. It's got the Silk Road Initiative. It's got the Asia Infrastructure Bank. It's building islands in the South China Sea. And it's got a trade agreement called RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, 16 countries, from India to Japan. And that agreement doesn't have any labor and environmental protections, and it doesn't protect intellectual property rights, and it doesn't put disciplines on government-owned corporations, and it doesn't maintain an open and free internet. It doesn't reflect those sorts of principles that were in TPP that were consistent with US interests and US values, but rather an image of the region that is more consistent with China's interests and China's values. And that's very detrimental to our workers and our farmers whose futures lie in being able to export and to engage in that region. So we're seeing this play out. We've heard from Prime Minister Abe to Prime Minister Turnbull to Prime Minister Lee to Prime Ministers of New Zealand all say, if the US doesn't move forward, it creates a void that China is willing to step into, and that even your closest military allies will feel the need to line up behind. And that's what we're seeing happen right now.
Mm-hmm. Take it away, Josh.
Yeah, I mean, just three quick things, because I am not a foreign policy expert. I mean, but one, I think it would be very hard to disentangle the effects of the TPP dying from the effects of Donald Trump becoming president in terms of generating unrest in lots of the world. Like, we're going to see some unrest with the election of Donald Trump, even if the TPP had never existed. So it's hard to disentangle those two, because I totally agree there's a lot of wariness. As an economic matter, the idea that the TPP could be a useful sort of spur to sort of lift up development in that region, it just didn't seem all that well designed to me to do that, because by not having China in it, two problems. One, if say the labor standards in TPP actually worked and started to sort of raise wages in those countries, China's not in there. China's becoming more competitive. And so basically, when they are competing for market share in the United States, and one country is set to a bunch of standards that raise their labor costs, but China is allowed to not be part of those standards, it's hard to see a lot of pressure on China from that. I see market opportunity. And then there's the issue of the rules of origin in the TPP were liberal enough that China could get a lot of the benefits of TPP, access to the US market, just by running lots of trade through the signatory countries. And so I think a trade agreement is a very tough instrument to use to change the trajectory of a country as powerful and multifaceted as China.
Mike,
Well, I
did
think
you-
what we saw is that as China's neighbors were engaging in raising their standards, we saw economic activity begin to shift from China to those countries. So investors saying, you know, I don't want to be in a country that's got rampant labor strikes, you know, where there's environmental damage that it creates reputational risk for us. You know, my expats hate living in a city that you can't breathe the air, right? Or there's no recourse when there's a dispute. And so the pressure, I think, on China comes from the fact that you've got 11 neighbors signing up to a higher set of standards. And by the way, not just the 11 neighbors, another 13 countries who were in contact with us saying they want to join after that they want to be part of this higher standard group. And that, I think, creates that competitive pressure, a race to the top, rather than allowing a race to the bottom.
I have a quick question. Josh, I'm not sure if you want to address it, but Mike, I know you, the business community overwhelmingly favors free trade and opposes President Trump's trade stance. And yet they've been very mute about this, and including about the specific of walking away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And they've chosen to focus on the things they do like, which is the prospect of deep tax cuts and slashing federal regulations. If protectionism and Trump's prospective policies are so bad for business, why aren't they speaking up more?
I think you identified it. I think they see big benefits in other policy realms. It's been, I mean, two things there. One, yes, it's amazing how much the modern Republican Party seems to prioritize tax cuts over almost everything else, and that is what keeps the coalition in line. And then the other issue is, over the past 10 years, there have been times where a policy change has been coming down the road that sort of liberals like me don't like, and there's been some sort of, you know what, don't worry, because this actually hurts some powerful business interests, and it's not going to happen. They're going to step in front of the ideological Republicans and say, no, you can't do that. The prime example was the sequester. It's never going to happen. There's military contractors who will be hurt. They will flex their muscle. It happened. You saw that with the Medicaid expansion across states. Medicaid expansion was very good for the hospital sector. That's a powerful sector, a lot of money. They will force even their Republican governors to take up the Medicaid expansion. It didn't happen. So when it comes to sort of betting on business interests to change the trajectory of the Republican Party over the past 10 years, it's been a losing bet.
Mike, this must have been frustrating to you because you didn't get business with a Republican-controlled Congress. You didn't get business leaders coming out very loudly in the past year when you were trying to get this done. So why are they so shy?
There were some business leaders who did, I think, a phenomenal job of articulating this and trying to organize and educating their employees and their supply chains and their communities. But I think, to your and Josh's point, I think they have prioritized, at least in the short run, taxes and regulatory relief, and have been willing to swallow trade and immigration policies that they may not like.
Right.
Now, we saw over the last week on immigration quite a significant reaction. So I don't know whether that's the beginning of a trend of coming back or not. And of course, taxes and regulation, those are difficult things to get done as well. So again, it's only been two and a half weeks. It feels much longer, but it's only been two and a half weeks. We'll have to see how this plays out. I think what we're going to see is, and I've heard from some businesses, contracts and investments already being canceled in various places because of the uncertainty. And that is going to ultimately, I think, mobilize them to say, you know, you can't throw away 70 years of a rules-based trading system or throw away generations worth of immigration policy that have supported U.S. growth and U.S. innovation, and that hopefully over time that will have an impact.
Let me ask a quick question before I turn it over to the rest of you, because it sort of brings it full circle to where we started. And you have this breakdown of any sort of consensus about trade, and in fact, the anti-trade protectionist forces are dominant right now. What would it take to change that? To me, it seems that it has, well, forget what I think. What is it going to take to change that? And I think here you could address greater compensation for the inevitable losers of trade, but that's what I think.
Was that a hint, Jackie? Is that yeah, look, and Josh alluded to this earlier as well. I think that's exactly right. I don't want to put it so much as compensation, but we need a much broader approach to, on one hand, helping equip people with the skills they need to succeed in a rapidly changing economy, and two, helping people and communities that are going through transition who are adversely affected by change. And in my view, and view of most of the economists, trade is a relatively small part of that. If you think about the impact that artificial intelligence and machine learning and the rest of new technology could have on the workforce, it's going to be substantially greater than globalization and any particular trade agreement. And we are not particularly well positioned as a federal government when it comes to recognizing and helping people who are adversely affected by change. So I think there's a lot of work to be done intellectually. There's work to be done in looking at what states have done, what other countries have done, what certain companies have done on training and retraining. But we have a long way to go before we're anywhere near having the adequate support that might help give people who have legitimate anxiety about wage stagnation, income inequality, give them the comfort to support policies as the world is changing so quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with the big picture there. I would quibble with specifics, but I think the big picture is really important. If you want to convince people that you are doing the right thing by them in terms of policy, they actually have to see their incomes and wages rising. You have to prove you're delivering the goods. And if you can prove that, then maybe they will be okay with, if 9 of your policies are lifting up their wages and 1 is not, they'll look at the net and be okay with that. So I think delivering the goods is the short answer. I think, the short answer. Slightly longer answer is I think it's a lot more than just technology, though. I think it's a fundamental problem of we have, through a lot of intentional policy decisions over the past 30 years, robbed bargaining power from low and moderate wage workers and given it to capital owners and corporate managers. Federal minimum wage is lower today than it was in 1968, even though we're 80% more productive. That's sort of crazy. We have not protected the right of willing workers to form unions and bargain collectively. We have not targeted genuine full employment as a policy goal. We get it episodically for a couple years here and there, but we used to get it much more regularly before 1979. We basically said fighting inflation is job one, and if we happen to get tight labor markets, that's great. So I think we've done a bunch of things that have shifted bargaining power, and it's mostly not about technology. I think technology has been mostly neutral in that distributional fight. It's mostly about bargaining power. But delivering the goods is how you're going to get people to be less anxious about globalization.
Okay, it's your turn. There are 2 people I think out there, and please wait for the mic before answering your question. And to echo David at the beginning, make sure there's a question mark at the end of your comment.
Hey, so this is for Mr. Froman. Mr. Froman, right? So this is about the TPP. I remember hearing concerns. I used to get a lot of emails from the NRDC and other environmental organizations that they were expressing concerns that the TPP would make it easier for corporations to sue the United States government on regulations that would protect the environment. So they're concerned that was actually going to make it harder to protect natural resources. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that.
So this refers to investor-state dispute settlement that was talked about earlier. And we've had investor-state dispute settlement in our agreements. We have 50 agreements that have it, 51 agreements actually. We've had it for 30 years. Over that 30-year period, 51 agreements, we've had a sum total of 17 cases that have been brought. And not a single case that went to conclusion did we lose. And that's because when we regulate, we have to regulate consistent with the Constitution, including the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment, which says if you expropriate, you have to compensate. And so our regulations are consistent with the Constitution. There's nothing in ISDS that goes beyond our Constitution. In fact, it's much narrower than our constitutional rights. And as a result, if people want to challenge U.S. environmental regulations, they tend to go to U.S. court. In U.S. court, you can get a regulation overturned on constitutional grounds, on administrative grounds, on statutory grounds. You can get compensation. Under ISDS, all you can do is get compensation if your investment protections have been violated. So we've had very few cases against us. We've never lost a case. And what we did in TPP, to go to a point that Josh made, is We made it even clearer that governments can regulate, that companies can't sue if regulations change, that companies can't sue if their profits have been disappointed because of changes in the regulatory environment. We made it all very open so that all the proceedings are open to the public, that environmental groups can file briefs and participate in the suits. In fact, the proceedings themselves are webcast, which is more transparent than the Supreme Court of the United States. And so we did a number of things to, in fact, respond to the criticisms of ISDS. Had TPP gone forward, or when TPP does go forward, those reforms will be put in place. In the absence of TPP, you're living with standards from the other 51 agreements. And so, like so many of these other issues, like labor, environment, ISDS, my question is always, isn't it better to improve, like to raise labor standards, to raise environmental standards, to reform ISDS, rather than stay with the status quo?
You want to take
Yeah,
that up,
just really
Josh?
quick word on ISDS. And so it's obviously objectively true that the U.S. has not lost an ISDS case. I mean, to my mind, the real concern with how ISDS has been used in the past is mostly American corporations using it as a battering ram against foreign governments' regulation. And you've seen that. I mean, the rationale for including ISDS at all in trade agreements is indeed, it's the idea that developing countries don't have a well-formed enough legal system to provide the investor protections that are needed for people to actually invest. It's a pretty well-studied question, and it does not do a whole lot to aid development. And so what it's still doing in trade treaties is a question in my mind. And there have been some advanced economies that have been sued under ISDS for public health. There's the cigarette labeling issue.
Which they won. The country won.
Yes.
They
voluntarily...
Australia won the case.
Because they voluntarily stopped including the warning on the cigarette packet.
Australia won the case. See, people raise the cases, but then they don't look at the end result. Australia, in the last year, won the case against Philip Morris International, saying that their regulations were fine to go forward.
In Canada, a province just voluntarily stopped including they took off advertising from the cigarette packet. They made it generic. They said there can be no advertising on cigarette packages. They all have to be plain white. They were sued, and they voluntarily dropped the regulation. So it was not a loss, but it was, I would argue, a loss for regulation.
Given the particular controversy over tobacco products, wasn't the Trans-Pacific Partnership specifically exempted tobacco companies
precisely for that
from
reason.
going before
Exactly.
the investor state?
No, that's exactly
disputes
right. It was the first trade agreement ever to do that. And what it said, because I think Josh is
Would it-
right, there have been tobacco companies that have abused ISDS to try and challenge countries' regulation on tobacco. And we made absolutely clear in TPP that countries could opt in to protecting their health regulations from challenge under ISDS on tobacco. And so, again, it's one of those things where if TPP moves forward, you get a reform system. If it doesn't move forward, then you live with the ambiguity. I mean, to me, the choice is pretty clear.
I'm sort of blinded by the light, so I can't see where the next question might be coming from, so I'll defer to my ambassadors here.
So after Trump's withdrawal from TPP, it's likely that he would adopt a network of bilateral free trade agreements. For example, the existing free trade agreement with Singapore and Korea, South Korea. So let's imagine that Trump is going to make a better deal with China. Maybe not a free trade deal, but at least a better one. And it seems to me that Trump would not focus on this non-tariff issue, like environmental issue or labor standard issue or a subsidy to SOE in China. On the one hand, Trump focused more on the tangible one, however misleading, the trade deficit with China or Chinese manipulation of currency. On the other hand, it's so difficult for China to improve on these non-tariff issues like labor standards. It always comes to the enforcement. And for free internet, it's totally, long way to go. So do you think that Trump would focus more on the more transactional, more trade tit for tat rather than this tariff issue?
I don't have any great wisdom on that to know what they intend to do in these bilateral agreements. Like you, I'm looking forward to hearing what they have in mind. I think the trade deficit is an interesting issue. and it's come up before. We know that exports are good, that they support well-paying jobs. The export-related jobs tend to pay up to 18% more than non-export-related jobs. Imports are it's more of a mixed story. Some imports substitute for domestic production. And if that is the process, if the products are being imported because of unfair trade practices, because a country is dumping or they're unlawfully subsidizing, or they don't keep their market open to our goods and are only selling goods here, that's exactly what trade agreements should be trying to get at. But we are also dependent on imports for things that we rely on in our own economy, for inputs into manufacturing. I mean, the example I love to use is coffee. We have a terrible trade deficit in coffee, $6 billion trade deficit. And by some economic analysis, they would say that means we have lost 50,000 jobs due to our coffee imports. Does that make any sense? If we stopped importing coffee, are we going to somehow have 50,000, more jobs in the United States? No, of course not. Same is true on oil. We import a lot of oil still. Do we think our import of oil is an issue of displacing U.S. workers, or does it have to do with the supply and demand and the marginal cost of producing an extra barrel of oil in one field versus another field? So it's a much more complicated issue. It's not difficult to run a trade surplus. We had a wonderful trade surplus during the Great Depression, right? And we had a yawning trade deficit during the 1990s when we added 20 million new jobs to the U.S. economy. So while I think it is important to look at trade balances to understand whether countries are engaging in fair trade or not, and to sort of be a signal as to where we may need to focus effort, I think if a trade policy is defined first and foremost or only as is a bilateral trade deficit going up or down, it misses a lot of the economics that trade balances reflect differential growth rates. When we're growing faster than our trading partners, we suck in imports and our trade deficit grows. Would we give up growth in order to have a more balanced trade? No, I don't think so. So it's a much more nuanced argument than that's the metric against which trade policy should be judged first and foremost.
Josh, did you want to address that China trade question?
No, because I know very little.
What, you don't know what Trump's going to do?
I cannot predict at all what he would do about that. You're right. Once you start talking about actually trying to identify non-tariff barriers and what to do about them, it becomes incredibly complex, and I'm already out of the picture. And then predicting what Trump would do, I will say, I mean, the trade deficit issue, I mean, there's two big things. One, it's true we don't make coffee, but that's why we look at the manufacturing trade deficit, which is much larger than the overall. And two, besides the fact that it just pushes jobs out of U.S. manufacturing, which, sometimes when we're at full employment, those jobs that are lost in Ohio are made up by construction workers in Phoenix, but you've still got displaced workers who are taking a lifetime hit. We should probably do something about that. And two, a trade deficit means we are sucking in lots of capital from much poorer countries. And this is capital that is probably more profitably invested abroad. Like the idea that China over the past 15 years spent $3 trillion buying US treasuries to have a trade surplus with the United States instead of using that money to do something in their own country with either public investment or, instead of having a weak exchange rate that took money out of their consumers' pockets, try to do some domestic demand growth. I mean, to me, the trade deficit really is a problem. You're right. If you look at it year to year, it can change for a million reasons, some good, some bad. It's been going on long enough in the United States that it is now pretty clearly, to me, can be defined as a problem that should be addressed.
Next question.
Only the left of the room has questions.
I think the lights are brighter coming
It's
this way.
it's our left.
Well, hello. So I wanted to ask about the TPP again, sorry. One of the most often heard criticisms, at least for me, was it's dealing with intellectual property rights, people said it extended America's life plus 70 to the other countries. So I wanted to ask both of you, ignoring diplomatic and political factors, how would you have preferred to see the TPP deal with this issue?
I'm actually, I don't know what the word is, an intellectual property libertarian or something like that. Like I think copyright and patent protection in the United States is already way too stringent. We've gone past anything like efficient incentives for innovation and have gone just straight into protecting way too long-lived monopolies to help the bottom line of powerfully connected countries. And given that, companies, and given that I think that, I sure don't think much of extending that to other countries. And especially when you take countries, especially poorer ones, we're asking them to pay a lot more for things like pharmaceutical and software, even though they don't produce much of that. And so that is just a pure net loss for them. And it also, if their consumers have to pay more for American intellectual property, that does crowd out spending they could be having for other American exports. And so if you're an American exporter and you're like, this agreement's going to be really good for my exports because some tariff barriers are going to go down, and there's truth to that, and then you realize, but a lot of the customers I'm hoping to sell to now have to pay more money for some other goods and IP-intensive industries, I think that's one reason why the exports sometimes disappoint following these agreements.
So a couple things. One is there's an estimated 40 million Americans who are employed in IP-intensive industries, whether it's trademark, copyright, patent, et cetera. If you're, when I went to LA and met with the Carpenters Union at the Paramount studio who are building sets for movies, their concern is, hey, we put all this effort into this movie, and then within 30 minutes of it being released, there are pirated copies all over the streets of China. In my view, if you're really serious about supporting Americans and American workers and making sure that they get the fruit of their labors, you should be against piracy. You should be for strong copyright. You should make sure that countries have civil and criminal penalties for illegally downloading satellite signals and cable signals and pirating movies and the rest, which is what TPP was all about. Second point I would say is it's interesting because there's a bit of a disconnect between kind of the NGO community here and many of the developing countries that we were negotiating with. A lot of the NGOs here, as Josh has alluded to, were arguing we shouldn't raise intellectual property rights standards in these other countries because it's bad for them. Those countries, I remember one in particular where we were arguing over textiles or something, and this country's counterpart said, in 10 years, I don't want to be making textiles. I want to be part of an innovative supply chain. I want to be making pharmaceuticals. I want to be having patented products. And that's why I want strong intellectual property rights protection in my country, because I want to make sure that this is an environment and an ecosystem that will promote innovation. So sometimes these countries know what's in their interest more than folks who purport to speak for them might otherwise believe. The third thing I'd say is, and look, I think there's a good, robust debate to have about pharmaceutical protections and pricing and the pricing in the United States, and I think we're having that discussion as we speak. I do know that much, if not most, of the pharmaceutical innovation that goes on in the world, the life-saving treatments that go on in the world, go on in the United States. And that's for a reason. And that's because we have strong intellectual property rights protection here that helps encourage investment into those products where we can argue whether it's exactly the right number of years or exactly how it works or what kind of pricing limitations there should be. That's an open discussion. The last thing I would say is, and this, as USTR, I don't make intellectual property rights policy. Congress speaks on these issues. And when Congress has said, this is the law of the land, this is how we have heard the democratic debate, we have weighed one side versus the other, we've weighed the costs versus the access, and we have determined that this is the appropriate balance. Our job is then to try and defend that balance, not to say we know better than Congress and the democratic process as to what intellectual property rights should be.
We have time for one last quick question. The man in the front row had his hand up from the beginning. Mm-hmm.
This has been a wonderful debate. I just wish we were more opportunities to have debates like this, but thank you both for coming to campus. To me, the trade agreements that are out there right now are sort of an attempt to correct for some things that they teach here at the University of Chicago about free markets. We talk about price discovery. We talk about having markets and not the people sitting in a room determining what the price of something is. That's what they do in the Soviet Union. And so the more dire situation right now is the fact that a lot of the people that moved from the South right after World War II, they came here for manufacturing jobs. And And they were able to get those jobs with very little education. And with those jobs, they were able to have 30-year employment, and people could take out 30-year mortgages, and you had small businesses that grew up around these people that made their wages, and there was opportunities for people to open small businesses. So you have corridors in Chicago, 63rd Street, 55th Street, 47th Street. These places used to be jam-packed with businesses, and they were serviced by people, working people who had these jobs, these manufacturing, all throughout the city. And so as one casually talks about the fact that we don't use manufacturing anymore, well, that manufacturing didn't disappear, it went someplace. And if you say automation was part of that, then how come the automation didn't come here instead of in China? We have a situation where...
Can we
yeah,
need to get to a question.
right. So the question gets to be, how does trade policy address what has been a tradition in this country, the working relationship between capital and labor? And it seems as though they had that in balance for about 40 years right after World War II. And then it just got disintegrated. And so what happened was that, would you comment on the fact of why labor productivity has not kept up with capital's productivity in the last 20 years? And what does that have to do with trade?
Sure. Well, first, I think anybody who says we don't manufacture things in the U.S. is wrong. Last year, we manufactured more product in the U.S. than ever before in our history. Now, we manufactured it with fewer workers. As Josh pointed out, particularly since 2000, there's been a decline of manufacturing workers. But even, just take autos. We are, from 2009 to 2016, we're producing 3 million more autos a year, from 9 million to 12 million a year. And we're doing it with fewer workers. Now, that's not trade. That's not a new trade agreement that made that happen, right? That is the continuing introduction of technology and automation. No, I think you're pointing out a very important problem, that worker salaries have not increased with worker productivity, and that the American dream was based on, if you got a manufacturing job, you could have the house, you could have the boat, you have the car, you had a strong community. And that has changed a lot, and for all sorts of reasons. Some is technology, some is globalization. I think I go back to the question, okay, then what do we do about it? We want to make sure that we're driving more economic activity to the US, so that there are more good jobs. We want more export-related jobs, because those are paid more. And we want to make sure that other countries aren't taking advantage of us because they don't have any workers' standards. They don't have any environmental standards. How do we achieve that? Our view is you achieve it by using the leverage of a trade agreement to raise those standards in other countries, to reduce those barriers to our exports so that our workers have a chance. And then you also deal with the issues of transition and education and skill building and lifelong learning and community college and apprenticeships and all the things we know we should be doing as a country to make sure that our young people and our not so young people, young at heart, are able to succeed and compete in a rapidly changing economy. We can't change change. We can't get rid of change. That's the immutable force. The question is, are we prepared to deal with it? And I don't think we've done enough on domestic policy to try and do it. I don't think the answer is, let's withdraw from international trade or try to lift the drawbridge. That only hurts the people that people purport to be wanting to support.
Josh, you want to have the last word?
Yeah, the biggest question with 1 second left.
Yeah.
So I'll be quick. I mean, yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I would say, as you alluded to, there's been this wedge. The economy-wide productivity has continued to grow over the past 30 years, and yet the pay of the typical worker has lagged far behind, and there's this growing wedge between the two. In my view, globalization is part of that wedge. It's not all of it, it's not most of it, but it's one of the portfolio of policy decisions we have made that have kept that typical worker's pay from keeping up with productivity. I think in terms of trade policy, to me, I said at the beginning, the two things we can get right is, one, get the currency right so we stop hemorrhaging jobs in manufacturing and even claw some of them back. We can claw some of them back. We can't go back to some mythical 1955, but we can get some of the manufacturing jobs back. And then we can make sure the jobs outside of manufacturing are good jobs. Manufacturing jobs, I would argue, were largely good jobs in the past because of unions and because we had full employment economy-wide. There's no reason we can't turn jobs that are currently really low paid into better jobs if workers are actually giving bargaining power in those growth sectors of the future. So in terms of trade, I think get the currency right, and I would stop the trade agreements that I think amplify the regressive distributional parts of trade.
Thank you both very much, and thank you to all of you for your attentiveness and your questions, and the real last word goes to David.
Well, because I didn't want you to have to thank yourself.
I'm
No,
just happy to be here.
This is a really profound subject, as witnessed by some of the questions that were asked. They touch on people's lives. They touch on values that we hold dear as a country, and they involve this warp speed change in global economics that we've seen. And this was a very, very intelligent discussion and very well moderated discussion. And I thank you both. And I particularly, and this is in no way diminishing anyone's contribution, but I really want to thank Mike Froman, who just finished his tour of duty as trade representative and could easily be on an island somewhere, like his old boss was. But instead was here with us to help shed some light on this issue. But thanks to all of you, and thanks to all of you for your great questions.